Professor Blight, is there anything you would like to add, perhaps, to the Supreme Court's understanding of the history that they were wrestling with today?
Oh, well, yes, but on the office business,
Please.
I'd like to see Justice Gorsuch go out to a lay audience that is deeply interested in this because they care and try to explain to them why he was wasting so much time on that distinction. Somebody should challenge him to do that. There really wasn't much history in today's discussions. And now that could be blamed partly on the lawyers who didn't prompt it, I suppose, but also, even when it came up, it was very strange. The worst example of all, in fact, the most ill-informed is a nice term for it, moment of history was when Justice Thomas kept asking, why weren't there more uses of this Section 3 in the end of Reconstruction and after Reconstruction, when the Redeemers came on the scene? Why wasn't this done more in the 19th century? And the lawyer finally landed on the right answer, which was because of the Amnesty Act of 1872, for God's sake. They were almost all given amnesty except the group who had served in Congress from 1859 to 1863. And that's all the lawyer needed to say. And the fact that Justice Thomas apparently doesn't even know that is appalling. I was also struck, Lawrence, at the sheer timidity of the justices to actually take on Section 3, to use it, to try to work with it. It's as though it's some horrible, awesome power that just cannot be used. And what if we end up, through this process, however it plays out and it's not over, with Section 3 essentially being erased from the 14th Amendment? What will that mean? This precious document. We live under the Constitution forged in that 14th Amendment. What if you tear out this section, which is the only way to hold people responsible who try to overthrow the government under law? Will we be a people of the rule of law if that part of the Constitution, in essence, gets erased?
Professor Faust, I was wondering what you were feeling and what Professor Blight was feeling, what historians feel when you're listening to these arguments that are dabbling in history, and some of them they start to pretend they've gone deep into history, and they are sifting the details the way professional historians do. What does that feel like for professional historians to be listening to that?
Well, it's a little unnerving, and actually the Jonathan Mitchell said at one point, law office history. This is not a phrase, excuse me, that I've heard before, but it seemed to me a very apt one about how you take things from the past and use them in relationship to a case in the present, rather than really getting into the heads of those who were thinking it and say, all right, what were they up to? What were their goals? What were their constraints? What was their sensibility in putting this forward? And I think David just made a wonderful point where he said, what is the 14th Amendment for? What was it for? What will we do without it? And instead, there were these very narrow approaches to how a little bit of it might be taken in one way or another. I'd love to hear David answer this.
There you go, Professor Blight.
Oh, well, Drew, you didn't need to do that. Well, I'll answer with another example. When Justice Roberts said, gee whiz, wasn't the 14th Amendment for the purpose of increasing federal power? The answer, of course, is of course it was. That's what John Bingham had in mind. He wanted to federalize the Bill of Rights. Of course it was. And therefore, Roberts was implying, well, you don't want to give this to the states. Good Lord. What was he thinking when he led the Shelby v. Holder case, where they simply gave back to the states control over voting rights instead of allowing the Voting Rights Act of 1865 to stay in place? It is this, I guess what bothers historians the most is not just that the knowledge isn't always that deep. I mean, we can be very arrogant about that, and we should not be. It's when people twist it and just cherry pick it and use it for what frankly are, even though they may not even be always aware of it, political reasons and political purposes. There was also a moment, I think it was Gorsuch, although I may not have that right. Maybe it was Alito, who said, can we really get back inside the minds of those people who were drafting the 14th Amendment? You bet we can. Our amicus brief that Drew and I worked with gets very much inside their heads. We have endless testimony of them saying what they were doing, why they were doing it, and that it was to be permanent. The answer is yes, we can get inside their minds on that one.
You know, Professor Faust, when I listen to both of you, I imagine the framers of the 14th sitting there in the front row today and just jumping out of their seats at certain points going, what do you mean? It's completely clear. What's the matter with you? This couldn't be more obvious. Well, how would they feel, Professor Faust?
Well, I often think that way too. And I kind of jam time together and imagine what someone from the past would be saying in the present. So I love that question. And I think they would be really upset. They would have their minds on insurrection. This was something that they bled and died to overcome in the 19th century. They saw it tear the country apart, and they glued the country back together, and they wanted to make sure that, as David just said, the 14th Amendment was for all time into the future. And here we are in the future, I think, failing to learn the lessons of how our nation was torn apart in the 19th century.
Relinquish what remains of the Allspark.
So who's the insect? You? What? Who's the insect?
Protect you. They were defeated on our world, and we will defeat them here.
This was just a diversion. Security, please bring up. Rabbit, she's already inside. Deeds! Give me an update on that reserve. Boss readiness. What was his name? What was it?
Evac, sir.
She's right in front.
We're facing a heavy, sustained attack. They appear to be after the Allspark. General! General! Immediately evacuate everything. Hold on. National security advisory. Stay down. Pushing it out. The mission celebrations. The amateurs for suicide mission.